Hi everyone, and welcome to this brief session looking at the role of pre-registration in social psychology, whilst also providing a little bit of an introduction to open science and open scholarship practices. This is a re-recording of a presentation I gave to the Social Psychology Lab of the University of Greenwich on the 13th of January 2022. So I'll just start off by introducing myself. So my name is Tom. It's wonderful to meet you all. Please do refer to me as he, him, his, or indeed Tom. I'm an associate professor in occupational psychology at the University of Greenwich, and I've got a lot of passion for meta-research and meta-science. So I'm often put in the box of occupational psychology, which is where some of my original research has taken place. But I like to think that my interests are kind of across boundaries, and I'm particularly interested in how we can improve our research culture and our research structures. And helpfully that has manifested in me becoming institutional lead for Greenwich within the UK Reproducibility Network, the UKRN, which does great work at championing UK science and trying to encourage us to be more rigorous and transparent in our research. So this is going to be a lot of kind of interactive bits, which obviously, because this is a pre-record, feel free to pause the video and have a moment to reflect and things, because there's lots of kind of interesting dynamics which unfortunately can't always be best communicated via a pre-record. So we're going to get started by looking at the research cycle. So this is our typical process of conducting research, starting off with generating a specific hypothesis, looking at designing a study to test that, collecting data, analysing that data and testing our hypotheses, interpreting that data, making some sort of value judgment around it and its potential value, and then publishing, disseminating that work and pursuing that loop, using that research to inform your next hypothesis. So my first activity here is to stop and reflect upon where the major issues might be within this research cycle. So we all know that as with everything involved with humans, it's not always perfect. So where might some of the core issues lie in producing problematic science? So I've provided some guesses and some gaps here to fill. Take just a few seconds to think about what might be the issues at these points within the research cycle. Now, this is where it gets fun. We're going to kind of fill in the gaps, as it were. There are so many kind of problematic practices or practices which could be problematic within the research cycle, and I've labelled them here. So the interesting thing is they're reflected across the research cycle. It starts off by what we decide to study. And typically what we tend to do as researchers is try and pick things which are going to get us published. And that often tends for us to rely upon pursuing novel directions of research, rather than doing things like replication studies, which help build a more robust basis for evidence, using a number of studies testing roughly the same sort of thing to give confidence that that is a true effect. And indeed what we find is that researchers much prefer pursuing novel lines of research than looking at replication works to try and build that coherent body of evidence. When we come to study design, we also have a number of issues at this point, where perhaps we might call something a pilot study rather than a normal, typical study, because we expect that we won't be able to collect that much data. So the best we can do is call it a pilot study and hope that people will forgive it, because that's the best we could do. Obviously, there are other issues where perhaps we haven't thought about how many participants we need before we start collecting the data, so we haven't done any sort of power analysis, or indeed we stop data collection before we have enough, and thus we have low power to detect our effects. We also have issues when it comes to data collection, analysis and interpretation, whereby we know of publication bias, whereby results which are statistically significant are more likely to be published than those which are non-significant or null findings, that we can do what's known as p-hacking, which is make certain small analysis decisions which increase the likelihood of us getting results which meet whatever our p-value benchmark is, typically 0.05. And so what we can do is we can keep exploring different avenues in the forking paths that analysis is. You can make subjective decisions around cut-offs or what to do with outliers or other such decisions. And such we can produce a statistically significant finding where perhaps that might not have been our original outcome, but it would help us get published because it's much harder to publish null findings than statistically significant ones. Similar to p-hacking is that perhaps when things are in a different direction to expected or things are not exactly as planned, because of the way we've set up our research publication process, which is we do all of the work, we write up a certain version of it, and we get that published, is that we can change our hypotheses, our approach, the theory we use to try and make it fit a more coherent story. Again, hopefully, or in the view of it, hopefully being more publishable because it is coherent and fluid rather than messy and contradictory, which obviously life isn't. Then we have issues around publication. So I've already mentioned publication bias, but we also have issues of transparency, and in particular, something I'm particularly interested in is data sharing, whereby the famous phrase, data will be made available upon reasonable request, which is seen in so many papers, but is such an ineffective way of sharing science, because when you contact people, they typically tend to not offer you that data even with a reasonable request. And so it's the culmination of these sorts of issues which provides us with quite often problematic results. And so the next question to ask is, Tom, I appreciate there might be some issues and there might be some bad people in science trying to play the game. But how bad are these issues? So what I've got now is some gaps for you to guess, for you to fill in the gaps. So where there's a question mark, try and put some numbers. So we've got 1 in how many papers tend to be replications. What is our chance of detecting medium effects? What is the prevalence of p-hacking and harking, also known as changing the hypotheses or hypothesizing after results are known? Looking at the percentage of people who fail to offer you data upon reasonable request, and the percentage of papers which tend to produce statistically significant results rather than null ones. So take a moment to go through, write some numbers, pause the video, have a guess or a guesstimate, and we'll go through them in just a moment. This is quite a tricky task, so don't worry too much. I guess this is just an opportunity to show the extent of the issues which are within our scientific practice. So here are the answers. This is all based on a paper by Marcus Manafo et al. Entitled A Manifesto for Reproducible Science. And we can see here that that is indeed the first recommended reading for this session. And we can see that, for example, 1 in 1,000 papers receives a replication attention. Typically, studies have low statistical power, that is about a 50% chance to detect medium effects. And as we might be able to anticipate, particularly within psychology, but indeed across all science, small effects are also important, but we don't have the confidence to be able to say they are there. We also have between 50 and 100% prevalence of p-hacking based on analysis of various samples. And that in of itself is a massive finding, that a minimum of half the papers we read have in some way had statistical results manipulated or deviated. And around 50 to 90% prevalence of harking or changing the hypotheses after the results are known. which again tells us something quite stark about the narrative that we perceive we have to provide to get something published. The final two is that when we have a look at the literature as a whole, estimates have suggested about 92% of findings which are published in the academic literature are statistically significant. And I mean, I like to think of myself as a good researcher and fairly relatively intelligent, but being able to get predictions of, hypotheses of findings correct 92% of the time seems extraordinarily high. And when indeed we ask people whether they would be willing to share their data upon reasonable request, typically about 30% of people do that, which obviously is very, very problematic. And we should all conclude from that individual gatekeeping of academic resources and materials is not an effective way to do so. Now, the whole of this narrative might come to suggest that actually probably researchers are terrible, and as a group of people we're all pretty rubbish. But I don't think that's a fair conclusion either. There are obviously things that we all do suboptimally, and that's not necessarily it's not necessarily fair to critique people on all of these things, given that we also have to acknowledge the culture and the context in which these sorts of practices take place. Now, we can imagine that a lot of these things happen because of problematic incentives within science. And particularly around this top left corner, around what we do to get funded or to get our research published. And this kind of devious cycle, as it were, where we continue to pursue these outcomes which are defined by the organizations we work with and things like that, that we must get publications and citations and funding. And the way to do that is not necessarily always the way of doing the best science possible. And that creates this paradox where the part of the research that's way beyond our control is the results, right? We should be able to decide what to study, how to study it, who to study it with. But the results aren't ours to control. But similarly, the part of our research which makes it the most important for advancing our career in terms of building those citations and publications are the results. And there's this conflict where we shouldn't touch the results, but make sure they're really good. And that obviously encourages people to do these suboptimal things. And sometimes we do them without even realizing, because they've been taught. They've been taught as normal practice, that's just what you do. You decide cut-offs based on your own subjective criteria. And so this is where we perceive this kind of dramatic conflict in kind of what's best for science, which is we want high-quality, transparent research that's published regardless of whatever the outcome is. And that's in conflict with what's best for scientists, which is often numbers, which is, right, we want to get publications, funding, citations, and all the other terrible things that people like to assess us on. Producing a great load of results, right? Going around that research cycle as quickly as possible, rather than going, let's build a really coherent, convincing body of evidence. And so there's this massive conflict. And so I want to highlight this because it's not just personal, it is structural. We try and do the very best we can, but what's best for us personally is to, find these sexy results, get those types of impacts, which, universities and others like to see, drive all the metrics forward, and use that to then, continue that cycle. And I want to also take another further zoom out and take another kind of perspective, meta perspective on this, which is, well, this isn't just about researchers. Whilst this is the kind of look I've taken at the moment, let's have a look at journals and see what journals want. Are they strongly motivated by quality? Well, they are strongly motivated to make money. That's for sure, right? So they make an awful lot of money because researchers and academics submit papers to them for free. So they give them their work, however long that's taken them to produce. They get other researchers, mugs like me, to review those works, provide free evaluative services of that. And then they charge us, or us indirectly through our universities or our libraries, to access those materials which we've written and we've reviewed. When you present it like that, it doesn't or shouldn't really come to a surprise that the profit margins of scholarly publishers are much, much higher than so many other industries which themselves are considered to have ridiculously high profit margins, so places like Google or Apple. And so journals, if they're motivated by money, and money is driven by people buying, reading, citing work, then they have a clear stake in the conversation, in that they want important papers, novel papers, papers that have some sort of novelty, new, unique, aspirational, inspirational content that doesn't necessarily relate to quality in any way, shape or form. The flip side is they're also motivated to not spend as much as they can, right? Which sometimes encourages people to keep articles short, thereby missing lots of detail, and the detail is often in the methodological sections, which are the most important for things like replications or reproducibility checks. And it also means that there's no incentives to spend lots of time on reviewing, fact-checking, things like that. And that is why the work by Elizabeth Bick, who does image forensics and finds out that copies of images of cells who are apparently completely different share similar properties, is so important, because it highlights the journals themselves also. This kind of wider structure that we work within is also problematic. So in having highlighted the scope of issues, I want to introduce you to the buffet. Welcome to the buffet, and this is how I kind of define and think about working with open scholarship practices, which is, if we want to do something about all these issues highlighted, then we need some sort of reform. Open science and open scholarship is a framework. It encapsulates a wide variety of practices, which in essence tries to maximize the transparency, the accessibility, and the quality of work, but also the wider infrastructure within which it occurs. So I've got a few kind of ideas of different kind of aspects or dimensions of open science here. And it can vary dramatically from open educational resources with teams like FORT, F-O-R-R-T, look them up if you haven't heard of them, to things like open data and ensuring that there are places where people can place their data safely, places like the OSF, and indeed places that publish just data sets where they can be valuable in of themselves, like the journal I lead, the Journal of Open Psychology Data. And so there's various kind of definitions, approaches, pillars of open science and open scholarship. I don't necessarily need you to encourage you to worry too much about that, but just to consider the fact that this really does go much wider than what is typically considered within kind of open science, which is sharing material, sharing data. It goes way beyond that to include things like whether we provide open peer review, whether we do advocacy of that and provide training in openness, and all these other kind of different dimensions. And whilst I toot this horn quite a lot, I think it's really important, and not because I think we're struggling to push this agenda forward, but because the agenda has already happened. And this training, I think, is really important because for things like Horizon 2020 and Horizon Europe, it's mandatory, particularly around publishing in open access journals and publishing your data to make sure they're accessible. We're now getting to the point where it's expected from some journals as a standard. Indeed, I'm working on it as part of various editorial roles that I have. It is becoming more of a kind of embedded conversation now. It's also being expected from recruiters, and we're slowly seeing a bank of resources suggesting that universities and indeed industry partners and others are more and more expecting skills around transparency and open scholarship. And whilst we have now moving into a different period of the COVID pandemic, which I feel you could be watching this in 2030, that still might be a relevant statement to make. What has been highlighted by that has been the dramatic role of openness, of sharing, of transparency within research, and the many impacts that can have. So I feel like it's really important that we have better training for these sorts of kind of practices and ideas. And so what I want to kind of tease forward just a little bit further is one such practice, one thing from the buffet, right? Whatever your favourite thing from the buffet is. I want to talk about what's known as pre-registration. So this is, in essence, a very simple practice. So what you have to do is you make decisions about what you're going to do for your research before you collect the data, and you publicly share them. So it's according to the Fort Glossary definition of pre-registration, it's the practice of publishing the plan for a study. For example, the research question or hypotheses, research design, data analysis, and others, before the data has been collected or examined. And so this is a very, very simple practice of essentially planning before you start data collection rather than attempting to make decisions afterwards, in an attempt to show that you are not using this garden of forking paths, right, to go in any direction you wish. You're instead showing that you have made pre-calculated, pre-justified decisions, and that thus you haven't been guided by any kind of subjective notion to increase the likelihood that, to come out with a statistically significant finding, for example. So I want to first start with a question of, what might happen if we did this more widely? And we often see lots of amusing tweets where people predict how the next political scandal or something is going to unfold. But what happened if your workforce on your workplace started to pre-register their plans for how they evaluate their initiatives? Within universities, there's always a new plan every few years for how they're going to deal with NSS and student satisfaction ratings, how they're going to deal with staff wellbeing initiatives. What might happen if all of a sudden they had to pre-register their plans of how they were going to collect data, what they were going to do with that data, what they were going to action afterwards? So, if data shows this, they will do this. What do you reckon might happen if that occurred? And it's incredibly provocative, but I think it does ask a valid question of how much of what happens, or what's represented within a journal article is due to this kind of more subjective kind of, I'll make the decisions as I go along and how they best suit me. And it's this that forms one of my another recommended reading for this session, my own, very big-headed, apologies, which explores whether this sort of pre-registration could happen and work for organisations and applied research, and exploring some of the kind of consequences and difficulties of negotiating that. So let's jump ahead to a key kind of idea, which is there a single right path to go for? So let's follow the work of a project exploring whether soccer referees are more likely to give red cards to dark skin tone players rather than light skin tone players. So this is the research question. And this project gave the same set of data to 61 teams of analysts who then independently analysed the data. Now, the way research methods is taught within psychology, I'd very much expect the answers to all be the same. They would go, it's this type of design, so it's this type of analysis, so we pop it in SPSS, we do this, we look for this box, we find this number, and that's the result. And this is not what happened. Actually, what happened was each team came to a different decision, a slightly different subjective outcome in reference to the research question. So when we talk about odds ratios, the effect size ranged from 0.89 to 2.93, with the median being 1.3. And so there was quite a lot of dramatic variation in effect size, which is obviously one of the most important things to examine as an output from analysis. And if we have a look at p-values and such, 69% of the groups reported a significant effect, whereas only 31% reported a non-significant effect. So we can see here there wasn't even a consensus, or a particularly strong consensus, as to whether the result was statistically significant or not. Obviously not the greatest issue if it was coherent for effect sizes, but it wasn't for that either. And so this tells us, and indeed this is part of our recommended reading for the session, it tells us that there are lots of decisions we make along the kind of analysis pathway, on the research pathways that we go through, and they don't always lead to the same outcome. So if they don't, then we need to be thinking very clearly about which decisions we do make. And that is what I think pre-registration can help with, is what's known as researcher degrees of freedom. So these are all the small decisions that we as researchers are not constrained by, that we're allowed to make. So what is the cutoff we choose for whether something is an outlier, or are we allowed to, combine groups to do some subgroup analysis, or whatever that might be. And so we have this garden of forking paths. We make a load of very small subjective decisions about a wide range of factors that could influence the decision, influence the outcome. And the issue here is that it's often opportunistic as to, what might create a more statistically significant result. And when I speak to people, when their research comes to a negative outcome, they go, oh, this can't be sure, I'll just double check. But when the result is statistically significant, they never question the finding. And I think this kind of taps into that kind of opportunistic chance to see if we can replay the game and see if we can come to a better outcome. And so it's by making people declare what decisions they're going to make before the data is collected, you limit the researcher degrees of freedom. And in doing so, I think that helps tackle things like p-hacking, harking, poor study design, all these sorts of things. And hopefully what pre-registration then does is it encourages us to make decisions about quality processes rather than desirable outcomes. So you shift the narrative from focusing on what the kind of outcome is and making that statistically significant and otherwise sexy and exciting, and instead focus on what is good process, what is a justified action. And you might be asking yourself, what are these kind of researcher degrees of freedom? What's the scope? Well, the scope is massive and wide. Here I've provided an image from Professor Whitshurst et al.'s paper, and you can see it covers all of the different stages of the research process, the research cycle, and it has loads of different opportunities for us to kind of massage, play, reform, reconsider, that can be problematic. And so in my view, pre-registration helps tackle some of these issues. It prevents us from being able to change the hypotheses because we openly, publicly declared it beforehand. It might constrain some p-hacking because we made some of our analysis decisions beforehand. And it can tackle kind of indirectly some of those other ones. Now, according to Professor Larkins, pre-registration is particularly useful for evaluating the severity of a test. So broadly speaking, pre-registration helps make things more transparent, particularly, if methods, the methods section of the final paper is fairly limited. But specifically, it can be useful for the severity of a test. So let's think about a typical NHST null hypothesis kind of approach, where we evaluate different kinds of outcomes. So a statistical test is severe when it's highly capable of demonstrating a claim is false. Now, say we have a very open prediction. So we say there will be differences between men and women in a certain outcome. That's a kind of two-sided, two-tailed hypothesis, right? In which case, all that we are essentially predicting is that it's not zero. It could be positive, it could be negative. We're not really saying anything apart from it's just not zero. When we have a directional hypothesis, obviously, as you can see here, all we're saying is we're anticipating it to be somewhere over here. Again, that tells us something, but perhaps not as much information as would be useful as to whether we kind of specified a specific range that we anticipated our results to be in. So in this case, for example, you might go based on meta-analyses, previous works, and you might do some kind of suggestion that it will be within a certain range. And so what pre-registration does, by giving us the transparency of seeing, what methods, analysis, approaches we're going to take, it allows us to see where a particular study is on this. So to what extent is the test severe, right? Is it highly capable of demonstrating a claim is false? Obviously, the further down you go and the narrower your prediction, the more severe. So this kind of transparency can be super useful because it gives us that sort of information, which is super useful for then providing some evaluative statement. My final kind of reflection on pre-registration, why it's useful, is that it provides a paper trail of research that exists regardless of publication status. So once you've uploaded your pre-registration to the Open Science Framework or some other online space, that's always going to exist, which means that when people are doing, for example, grey literature searches of literature that perhaps isn't necessarily published yet or is pre-printed or otherwise, that can help us show the full scope of work that's been done in a field, not just the stuff that's got through the peer review and publication process. And in doing so, that can be quite useful for challenging publication bias, where we tend to see only statistically significant findings reported in the literature. Pre-reg can also help with what's known as carking, not an especially exciting acronym, but critique after results are known. So I'm sure many of you have had experience of this or have heard of examples of this where you get rejections or unhelpful peer review comments where they encourage you to add more studies, change your hypotheses, reframe your work around a new theory or narrative, or update it based upon whatever that might be. When you pre-register, you've got a very solid case for not doing that, and indeed finding a way of differentiating what you pre-registered from things that you're being encouraged to do, which are more exploratory or opportunistic. And finally, if you've got a paper trail that shows in detail how you're going to do a study, how you're going to analyse it, and all that sort of important detail, that's also going to be super useful for being recognised for doing high quality work because it will be available. And indeed, some journals offer badges, which is essentially a sticker slapped at the top of the paper, which shows that you have pre-registered some elements of your study. So those are my kind of three core ideas around why pre-registration could be super useful. So it constrains your garden of forking paths to or at least to some extent constrains them, thereby giving you less kind of scope for p-hacking and otherwise. It also is useful for being able to really transparently view and evaluate a research project, and in doing so being able to examine the severity of the statistical tests. And then also you've got this paper trail, which is useful for publication bias and can also be personally useful for things like recognition and for kind of critiquing or defending against reviewer claims. From my own experience, I think it is complex, and so it's very easy to think this sounds too easy or too good to be true. So I want to give you a bit more of my own kind of N is 1 experience on this. And the first thing to reflect upon is that what it is very good at doing is front-loading all your work. So rather than distributing it across the research process, kicking it down the long grass, it's incredibly useful for thinking about everything before you start data collection. Indeed, including things like how I design my Qualtrics site, the analysis code that I'm going to use. So I use a software called R and RStudio, which can be used for data analysis. And indeed, I can pre-register those analysis codes before data collection as well. And this might be very frustrating in that it means you've got to do essentially every single part of the research process before you then get to data collection. But it is really helpful. So I was part of a funded project by the US Department for Defense doing a replication, the SCORE project. And whilst pre-reg was a lot of work for that, I had basically done everything before we started data collection. So the Qualtrics, the analysis, the kind of formatting of outputs. So in essence, when I finished data collection, I turned off the Qualtrics link, I downloaded the data file, I changed the titles from mock data file to data file in the analysis code, and before my kettle was boiled, all of my data was cleaned, processed, analysed, and I could see the outcomes of that particular research project. That was an incredible experience because, in essence, it put all the stuff which was important to think about early in the process. And so sometimes it's very easy to have a broad sense of what you want to do, but not necessarily a specific plan. Whereas this allows you to do that and think that through at a time where you can, ask for feedback, change the research design if it doesn't quite fit, and all those other things. Now, the second kind of reflection is that people say it doesn't lead to better research. And I agree, it's not necessary. It doesn't necessarily do that. That isn't an expected outcome. But what it does do is it can get you to think more about certain things at a time where you can make changes. And so the benefits are not the kind of sexy kind, which makes all research immediately publishable and newsworthy and great. It doesn't do that. But what it does do is it encourages you to be thoughtful about every aspect of the research design, to plan it, and to really process how you're going to manage that. And I've got to say, when it comes to pre-registration, my future Tom or current Tom is always incredibly grateful for past Tom. Having all that stuff detailed and explained and justified means that when I then come to do it later, I don't have to worry about, what happens if it doesn't matter because it's already done. And so in my role as editor and various other kind of positions, I've had quite a look at quite a lot of pre-registrations, and my advice for those who are interested in pursuing them is that detail matters, because that minimises their research degrees of freedom. A vague, non-committal pre-registration is pointless. It's a waste of time. Don't bother. If you're going to do pre-registration, the point here is you provide detail that constrains your ability to make lots of free decisions, and in doing so provides a transparent account of what you do. So you may go from this, oh gosh, Tom, you are incredibly positive about all this, but I've still got worries. And you know what? You'd be justified. Valid concerns I think you still might have, and the emphasis here is on valid, is that it is a prison, that it constrains you, that you get penalised if you have to deviate, that it stifles creativity, it's not suitable for exploration, it's not suitable for secondary data, or perhaps that it's only relevant for those who probably would have p-hacked, but because I'm a good researcher and I have no intention of doing so, it has no value for me. Equally, you might think it might not work for my area, you might be qualitative, you might have a certain kind of field of interest, or indeed that it sounds too easy or too good to be true. These are certainly valid, and I don't want to dismiss these, what I want to do is to present you with some ideas that I think might reassure you that the pre-reg is manageable and valuable nevertheless, despite some of these concerns. Now, the first one is that pre-reg is a prison. Now, this is a kind of somewhat of a misconception in that it is designed to constrain you. It is designed to limit you, but that's the whole point. If it didn't, it would have no value. So it should constrain you and limit you to some extent. But what you should also accept is that it's a plan. This is a best case scenario of what I anticipate I will be doing. It is not a prison. Nothing is written in stone. Changes can be made at any point. They just need to be transparently logged and recorded. So from my own experience, I think most, if not all, of the pre-registered projects I've been involved in have to some extent, mostly incredibly minor, but nevertheless to some extent, deviated from the pre-registration protocol. In my experience, this has never been perceived negatively, because people see the value in being transparent about the deviation. So I have a section in all my papers around deviations from pre-registration, where I transparently list all of what I've done and why I've changed things. They're happy I told them about it. They're not angry that everything didn't go exactly to my original plan. That's my experience, and I'm sure there have been some contrasting ones. But most of the time, people are just happy to see the detail and to see that you've consciously, explicitly kind of justified an alternative approach. So you do not need to worry about it being a prison or that you will be penalised for deviating. In all but perhaps very extreme cases, it's perfectly fine for you to do so long as you justify it and log it. The next concern is that it stifles creativity or isn't suitable for exploration or secondary data. Now, to counter the last point explicitly, there are templates, discussions around the value and the how-to of pre-registration of secondary data analysis, and you can see the paper here by Van der Akker et al., which is super useful on this. As for stifling creativity and exploration, there are ways of mitigating this. Now, my recommendations are to have two different analysis sections, one of which is essentially pre-registered analyses, and the second is exploratory or otherwise non-pre-registered analyses. And again, people don't tend to find that offensive, that I've got data, I've done exactly what I promised I would do with it, but I've also had some other things that I, due to the unique nature of the data, and you can't predict everything, I've also found it useful to explore these other things. That can also be a really powerful tool to differentiate between these kind of exploratory analyses and confirmatory analyses. And indeed, some people have labelled them as such. So you can negotiate that as well. As for whether it's mostly for, people with bad intentions rather than good, these issues affect us all. If I haven't been able to kind of express that to you in some of the early slides, I'm probably not doing my job particularly well. These are things that we all do, whether conscious or not, because we follow the norms, we follow, standardized SPSS outputs, whatever that is. We do things suboptimally. We're human. Embrace that, accept that, love the fact that we fail, we make mistakes, we do all sorts of, things not optimally. That does happen. So I would much prefer to pre-register and be confident, or slightly more confident in the research findings than not. I do accept there is some value around that argument, but also think of the other benefits of pre-registration. So, for example, having a clear and transparent line of paperwork, that can be super useful for recognition and other reasons. So it's not necessarily all about trying to kind of catch out bad work or bad people, because nothing is that simple. The concerns also that it wouldn't work for my area or whatever that is also a valid concern. There are lots of different templates, as you can see, some on the screen, some for social psychology, for replications. There's some specifically for qualitative research, for secondary data or secondary analyses. There's some for experimental, biological, sociological. There's loads of different templates that you can use which kind of might be more relevant to your particular research domain. It's worth exploring. Perhaps to challenge your expectations that it's not relevant and to explore what might be possible. Now, the final concern, and I think this is, again, a really, really valid point to make, is that it sounds too easy to be true by just saying what I'm going to do, and then you go and do it, and that's somehow better. It really is a skill. Being able to produce a quality pre-registration protocol is not the world's easiest thing to do. I find it really useful, and I do it with all my students because I think it gets them to really think about all the different kind of processes and stages of the research. But it does take time. It takes time and effort and skill, and to know what to include and what not to, and that you need to justify everything. All these things does take a little while to familiarise and get comfortable with. On the OSF page associated with this training session, I've provided a number of examples of pre-registration led by students, some templates with all the kind of guidance and advice. There's a bank of resources there to rely upon and to use, so feel free to dip into that and perhaps consider whether it might work for you. The other thing to note is also all these open practices, it's like a buffet. You don't have to load your plate with everything. Sometimes that's the best thing in the world because you get a bit of everything and that's what you love and you've really done your best. Sometimes you know what you want and know what's best for you, and sometimes it isn't all of the things, right? Don't fill up on the rice and the noodles, go for the protein, right? So there's those sorts of things to consider as well. It might not be right for you or your field, but being aware of it and being able to understand where in the future it might be of value to you is a really useful outcome. Now, for getting started, there's two key places I encourage people to go. The first is the OSF, so the Open Science Framework, and this is because they have a site where you can upload all your research materials, your analysis plans, your recruitment materials, whatever that is, and you can have the pre-registration linked to all those materials, and it's all there. And you can use any of these kind of preset templates and options and just input the text straight away, and it is good to go. I find that to be super useful. There's also a very kind of simplistic protocol called aspredicted.org, and this is really useful, particularly for students, because it's a little more simplified. There's less options to go wrong. And again, there's a very few amount of questions where you basically detail what you anticipate to be able to do, an analysis, and that again is a way of going through it. So that's probably the most accessible way of doing to get started, and then you can perhaps work your way to more kind of sophisticated and subject relevant templates through the OSF. Again, all the materials are on the associated OSF page for this presentation, so you can have a look and see which best fits. I don't have a preference. I tend to change based on what is the most appropriate for my specific study. So I really encourage you to give it a go and try it. It's, as I say, it's a skill you get better with experience from looking at examples, and so don't expect too much, but you allow yourself to explore the questions that are asked in those templates to really give you some sense of what's important. Okie dokie. So that's the core I wanted to cover, but I also want to go a little bit further down this story, which is we have, based on the research cycle we talked at the start, we have hopefully come to the conclusion that the way we do research at the moment is suboptimal. The way we publish research is suboptimal. We wait till the very end where we can have manipulated absolutely everything, and we give people a few pages of Microsoft Word document or a few pages of PDF and be able to judge all of my research based on that tiny little output. And that's clearly suboptimal. It reflects, interests in results more than methods. So I want to share with you a side point, which is a new type of publication, which is called registered reports. Now, this is essentially a peer-reviewed type of pre-registration, but let me talk through the reasons why it's so useful and why it's changed my approach to publication. So, if we're trying to fix the research system, we first need to make results a kind of dead currency in terms of quality evaluation. We need to make sure that we focus on the method rather than results. So the premise is that what gives hypothesis testing its scientific value is the question it asks, the social value of exploring this domain, the quality of the methods we use to study it. But actually, the results, the specific results, don't give that research any scientific value. And so if we accept this philosophy, then really journals should be doing results blind peer review. Some journals do that. Some asks for everything up to the results stage, and then they'll review it at that point. An easier way to do this is to differentiate between work done before data collection and work done afterwards, because you can still manipulate things even if the reviewers and editors are blind to the results. So this is how registered reports work. So we start off with essentially a very detailed pre-registration. Okay, so we have the introduction, the methods, any kind of pilot type work, and an analysis plan. And what goes on next is you submit that. You submit that for publication. And so reviewers assess this, they peer review this plan. So in essence, they ask, is the hypothesis well founded? Is the methods robust? The analysis appropriate? Is the study well powered? Have you got enough controls to make sure it's a fair test? All these sorts of useful things. And so you actually get feedback when it matters, when you can make changes to the work rather than afterwards. And indeed, I've had lots of, all of them think I can struggle to pick an experience when my peer reviews from submitted registered reports haven't been incredibly useful, positive, kind of forward thinking rather than kind of critical. They've been incredibly constructive pieces of feedback. And so what happens is you can go around many stages of review and you might get asked to add more studies or things like that. One of my latest ones, I anticipated doing a direct replication of a former study, and they encouraged me to also explore a conceptual replication which could complement the direct replication in various ways. I agreed it was of value, so designed it, and they accepted it. And so what acceptance means at this point is in-principle acceptance. So what you have is a stage 1 registered report accepted in principle, so you get an IPA. And what this is a promise from the publishers that they will publish your work regardless of what the results are. So it doesn't matter whether they supported your hypotheses, completely contradicted, came out a jumble of a mess and didn't really make themselves open to any sort of interpretation whatsoever. It doesn't matter. Basically, getting published is dependent upon the quality of your methods and your questions, not the results. So as soon as you have in-principle acceptance, you publicly declare and publish your stage 1 registered report, so that it is pre-registered, and then you do the research. You just do what you said you would do in that pre-registered protocol. If anything changes, you declare that. You can have conversations with the editor if issues come up around, issues with data collection, changes in time frame, anything like that. And afterwards, you submit a stage 2 manuscript. Here, the introduction and methods should be exactly the same, virtually unchanged from the stage 1 manuscript. So that requires no change. You might want to add violations or kind of changes since pre-registration. You then provide your results section, which is the new component. And here you can differentiate, should you wish to, between registered confirmatory analyses and unpre-registered exploratory analyses. And your discussion section. which is exactly as it normally would be. My 7 core components are typically a wordy description of results, how they relate to your hypotheses, how they relate to your theory, how they relate to your previous literature, and then limitations, future research, and applications. And what we do is deposit our data and our materials in a public archive, so it's the kind of a public log of absolutely everything related to the study. This then gets peer reviewed again. Now you may think, gosh, 2 rounds of peer review. Well, it really isn't that bad, and I've never actually had a particularly painful stage 2 peer review experience. All they in essence do is check whether you've done what you said you would do, whether you've passed basic kind of quality checks, and whether the conclusions and the interpretations are based upon the data that you've provided. So it isn't like undergoing a brand new review. And at this stage, reviewers know, and they're normally the same reviewers who reviewed the protocol at stage 1, that they're not aiming to make they can't make any massive design changes. They have to work with, what you said you would do. So it can be very, very, very positive experiences. And the manuscript's published. So I wanted to kind of visualize this in a different way, just to make sure you get the message that you develop your idea, you design your study, and that gets peer reviewed before you collect data. Afterwards, you collect the data and you transparently report any deviations from your pre-registration. You write it all up, and that gets a second kind of stage of peer review. This is a much more basic account of, have you followed what you said you'd do and reported deviations and made reasonable conclusions, and it's publication time. The flag. It doesn't matter whether hypotheses are supported, whether p-value is anything, whether results are novel, or indeed whether results have impact. It just doesn't matter. And so this is a really important step forward for science in prioritising quality of method, not results. And indeed, there's been some kind of proposed advantages of this, in that things should be highly reproducible, so you should be able to reproduce the findings using the data and the analysis code. You should be able to kind of replicate it because all the materials are there. You should have high statistical power because the study has been designed specifically to explore that particular effect. There's obviously the benefits of transparency for data, materials, and differentiation between confirmatory and exploratory analyses. And you also get the advantages of credibility, which is, there's been no publication bias, hindsight bias, and there's been no selective reporting because everything has been coherent with the pre-registration. So I'm really excited because I think this is in essence where the vast majority of publications and academic publishers are going to go, and it's much more rigorous and robust. And I've got to say from my own experience, much more positive in that reviewers genuinely want to help and support you and make the study the best they can be. It's very less so of a kind of critical, let's rip shreds out of it and make you feel like a P. It's really designed to be a kind of more supportive environment. And there have been many kind of advantages, other advantages noted, including feedback when it's most useful, higher acceptance rate. Basically, there's only been one example of a stage 2 registered report that has been rejected following in principle acceptance, and it was because they went off the rails, I think. You're more likely to get accepted in the first journal you submit to, and indeed, every registered report I've submitted, personally, I've had accepted, and I think some of my collaborative works, I think maybe one was rejected, but then accepted in the next place. You get a paper accepted before you start the research, so you kind of get early outcomes, which is nice because if your boss is on your back, or otherwise you get those outcomes easily. And there's a suggestion that the work might be better cited. And indeed, some literature has already started to suggest that, here we go, right at the bottom right-hand side here, that papers that are pre-registered tend to receive either the same amount of citations as expected or more so relative to the journal impact factor. That there is a sharp rise in null findings of registered reports compared to the traditional academic literature. So here we have percentage of null findings in registered reports and other, much higher than 50% in the traditional literature, around less than 15% or so. Hypotheses are about 5 times more likely to be unsupported in registered reports, and so obviously that shows that there's this publication bias. And so we can see here some more data on that. There's been a couple of kind of empirical examinations of these, and these all give me a little bit of hope that perhaps we might be able to fix some of the issues we've highlighted. There's a lot of fixing to be done, and I think there's a lot of work that's needed, kind of both structurally and in kind of more local cultural kind of zones, because I think some are certainly more receptive to these sorts of kind of initiatives than others. And obviously, if you've spent your whole career and the traditional approach has worked for you and you've benefited from it, feels very hard to then kind of champion a different approach where perhaps your contacts or your reputation or such might not play such an important factor. I'm hopeful, but change is slow. But I'm hoping that I've kind of opened your eyes to perhaps some of the extent of some of the issues and how pre-registration might be an interesting practice to consider as part of a buffet range of options that you can do to improve the transparency and rigour of your research. Well, that's it. I am so grateful for your time. I really hope this has been interesting and you've enjoyed. I'm obviously very, very happy to be contacted around pre-registration, open science more generally. So if you want to do so, feel free to provide comments. Come find me on Twitter at Thomas Rees Evans, or indeed you can find me or contact details for me on my website, thomas-rees-evans.netlify.app. Thanks so much. Take care, everyone. Stay safe and enjoy pre-registering your next project. Take care.